some of what President. Aha. Okay, we're now being recorded. That some of what President Trump has done to disrupt and dismantle that system. Other sessions looked at elements of the overall system, trade, alliances, the use of security arrangements in effort to combat the proliferation of nuclear weapons, international law, and human rights. The final session will look at international multinational institutions, which I regard as one of the pillars of the U.S. envisioned system. That they weren't all invented by the United States. They sometimes not effectively used by the United States, but an important part of the overall. And I'm very happy this evening to be able to introduce my friend and colleague of many years, Steve Stedman. That we over the years have talked about international organizations many times. We have slightly different views on their effectiveness, but we're in absolute agreement, I think, on how important they are, on how important it is to get it right in terms of building it and utilizing it. As always, I will not give Steve the kind of introduction he deserves in order to maximize time for substantive discussion. But what I think is important to know is that he is a senior fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He sits in the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. That among his other past positions, he was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations under Kofi Annan and a special advisor to the Secretary General, and authored a number of reports on maintaining international harmony, security, dealing with post-conflict justice and similar issues. So without further taking from your time, Steve, thank you for being here. You'll speak for as long as you wish, and then we'll open it up to questions here in the room and from those participating on Zoom. Now get out of your way.
Terrific. Thanks, Tom. Thank you all. Despite everything, the internet can still be a pretty amazing thing. In my inbox, just about 3 days ago, for some reason, I'm on the mailing list of a think tank in Bulgaria, believe it or not. And they sent one of their regular reports out. And there was just something about it that caught my eye, and I started reading it. It's a retired Bulgarian colonel reflecting on today's international politics. I'm just going to read you the first paragraph because you'll see why I immediately then spent the next 20 minutes actually reading. It was about a 10-page document. This is the first paragraph. There are times in history when the world is not only becoming more dangerous, but harder to understand. And not because information is lacking, but on the contrary, because its abundance fragments reality into multiple competing versions, each coherent in itself, but incompatible with the others. We live in such a moment. I'm currently teaching a course for undergrads at Stanford called Making Sense of Current International Politics. So I just want, so this is a disclaimer, is that if I actually could make sense of international politics today, I would not be teaching this class on making sense, because I'm hoping that, I bring in guests like here, and, I'm hoping that they're going to tell me, how do you make sense of today's international politics? As Tom said, I worked 2 years at the UN, and my job, it was kind of, I felt like Sisyphus at the time, because I was brought in 2003, in the fall of 2003, after President George Bush and the United States had gone to war in Iraq without a Security Council authorization. The United States was not very popular within the UN at that time. But my boss, Kofi Annan, understood that you could not have a functioning United Nations without the United States seeing it as important and wanting it to succeed. And so I was the guy who was brought in to try to put forward ideas for how do you reform the United Nations system to make it relevant to the 21st century. And in particular, in terms of security, what can the UN do better to protect against transnational threats like pandemics or transnational terrorism? Nobody thought we could succeed at the time. So expectations were very low, which is, I found out in public life, that's a good thing. Expectations are low. It's not hard to beat them. But what we found at the time, this was in 2003, was that actually even countries that you would think of as being somewhat hostile to the United States, or let's just say really ambivalent about the United States, all wanted us to succeed. They wanted us to come up with ideas that were going to be appealing to the United States to bring them back in and make them confident that that US security could be maintained by working multilaterally through the United Nations and strengthening the United Nations. I bring this up because there is something in the reading for this week that I think is not a helpful narrative. It's the second article, not the article by Bissett, but the article that talks about the UN, and it gives some questions. And one of the questions is, should the United States pursue its interests and security through multilateral organizations and cooperation, or by pursuing its national interests? And I said, no, you don't get it. It's like the only way that cooperation happens at the United Nations is that everybody feels that it is in their national interest to cooperate. If you cannot make that case, you will not get cooperation. It's not like leaders fly into the UN and then you try to have like a schmooze fest and make everybody feel good and just let's just get along. That's not how it works. You have to make cases to them about, President Bush, you say you're worried about the threat of catastrophic terrorism, right? Well, how are you going to protect the United States without international cooperation, without governments around the world sharing information, without governments around the world monitoring some of the bad guys that you don't like? How do we do it without, monitoring, various materials that could be necessary to create, some kind of bomb that terrorists could use that would just inflict massive amounts of damage and destruction? Who's going to help you with their finances when they're moving money, in dark markets and stuff? And that's how we proceeded, was whenever we put forward a recommendation, the job was, how is this in the interests of these countries? How is this interest? Because we knew if you could not make a case that this is in your interest, they're not going to be interested. They don't care. They're not going to cooperate to be good guys. They're going to cooperate because there's going to be a result. They're going to be safer at the end of the day. Then you're okay, right? And I feel like that has been really lost at the UN. Certainly over the last, I would actually go back almost 10 years now, where I feel like people at the UN tend to assume that what they're doing, everybody sees the value of it, and they don't have to actually convince people of the value of it. And they also forget at times that they are first and foremost, a member state organization. The United Nations is made up of, how many, Tom, now? 194? 193, yeah. It's like, I think it was actually 191 when I was there, so it keeps going up. But those are the members of the UN. And the UN has gotten very comfortable at convincing civil society and NGOs about how great they are. But in some ways, they don't count, right? In the end, you've got to convince governments that it is in their interest to cooperate. And I really feel that that's been lost. The second thing I would say about the UN these days is that it is no longer relevant. It has made itself irrelevant on the most important functions that it's supposed to have, which is the maintenance of peace and security. When back in October of 2023, when Hamas carried out this, the just god-awful terrorist attack into Israel, and then the Israel response and the obliteration of Palestine and Gaza, there was like crickets from the United Nations, from the Secretary General. There was no attempt to like try to put forward some kind of diplomatic initiative. Just 20 years before, I was there in 2003 to 2005, and the UN at that time was a central player in anything happening with diplomacy in the Middle East. They were one of the Quad, along with the United States, the EU. They were there. They had really good people. And Kofi was a diplomat, and that's our bread and butter. If there is conflict in the world, we're supposed to be there trying to make peace. They're absent. And they're absent because I think the current Secretary General thinks his job is to just use the UN as a bully pulpit. He gives a lot of speeches and a lot of condemnation of abhorrent things. I mean, there's so much abhorrent things going on in the world right now. But the thing is, if you're Secretary General of the United Nations, you have all kinds of people who can make speeches about the abhorrent things, right? You have the people in human rights who can call out on human rights. You have people, who, on all kinds of things can make your speeches. When you make the speeches that are condemning behavior of your member states, you are making yourself irrelevant in the future for solving that problem. And this happened almost immediately in the case of Israel. When Israel went into Gaza, it was about 4 days into the conflict, and the Secretary General says, war crimes could be happening. And indeed, they may have been. And, probably a good case in the 2 years of war crimes. He shouldn't have been the person to say it. The reason that he shouldn't have been the person to say it was because if you're the Secretary General, what you want is, at some point, these parties in conflict are going to want a way out. And there are very few places where people can turn, where governments can turn to look for a way out. Kofi was a genius at this. This was, you make the UN relevant. And if you can't do that, don't be surprised when nobody pays their bills and turns away from the organization, or just gets tired of it and turns off the earpieces and just doesn't listen anymore. So that part of it is, has been difficult for me watching. But it's there to see. It is simply irrelevant right now. On the economic side, it too should be super relevant. It isn't. I don't think this is a fault of the WTO or a fault of the Bretton Woods institutions. This is the fault of largely the United States turning its back on an economic set of rules that it helped create for 50 years, 60 years. I understand kind of why they did it, but I think they got it wrong. So let me just give you some background. When I first met Tom, we were both at Stanford. I was an undergrad. Tom was a grad student. And then Tom went off to Washington, and then I stayed at Stanford to get my PhD. And at Stanford at the time, first of all, just if you study international relations at the time, there was this really bad division. Somehow the field was subdivided into international security and international political economy, as if there was no connection between international political economy and international security, and back and forth, right? But my advisor at the time, a guy named Bob North, had this theory that he had worked out, which was very pessimistic about economic interdependence. He argued that what happens is that when countries become economically interdependent, this does not reduce conflict. It actually increases conflict because it increases friction, because they're constantly running into each other. There's going to be constant disputes. And his argument was that this constant sort of butting up against each other because of interdependence is something that once you get into sort of difficulties having to do with shortages of resources and so forth, it's going to be a conflict generating machine. At the same time, there was an argument about international political economy that said trading nations don't go to war. So interdependence is a really good thing. The more international trade there is, the more international commerce, the more economic interdependence is a more peaceful world. And at the time, I thought Bob North was right, and the optimistic theory was wrong. But, you know, for 30 years, the optimists looked really, really good, right? Let's just, take 2015. So that would have been 30. I was in grad school like 82 to 86. So 30 years later, the economic interdependence people looked really good. There had been a reduction in wars in the world between 1992 to about 2010, 2012, which was the biggest reduction in wars and violent conflict in the world in about 200 years. That's impressive. I mean, it's remarkable when you looked at it. And then also, what was happening with economic interdependence and globalization? Well, poverty was actually decreasing in the world. International inequality, equality between countries and stuff was being reduced during that time. Life expectancy was going up. Food security had improved dramatically. Infant mortality around the world had dropped dramatically. This was, and it was incredibly frustrating for me at the time because I would read these analyses about, oh, the world is in crisis, the world is in chaos. I was like, no, it's not. It's actually looking really good. And, it's like economic, trade and globalization, free markets, free movement of people, free movement of, this is actually this is good stuff. It's making a difference. But it didn't make a difference for small populations within the industrial world, and who started to demand much more populist government, much more populist economics. They wanted protection. It makes sense. But what happened was the blame was put on globalization as opposed to the blame being put on governments who are supposed to compensate for people who lose in globalization. How do you compensate? Job programs, job training, you figure it out. And some countries have, some European countries have. The United States has done a pretty poor job of figuring that out. And there was a time during the Obama administration, first year of the Obama administration, as Tom knows, every president has to come up with a national security strategy that they have to present to Congress. And Obama's first national security strategy was all about, remember, this is 2009, 2010, after the economic collapse, right? The strategy was trying to convince Americans that we need not fear globalization. This was a really important message. Through education, through science, through training, we need not fear globalization. Do you know that he never spoke on behalf of his own national security strategy? He let it die. He let Hillary Clinton run with it as Secretary of State. He never said a word. And that was irresponsible, because in fact, that was such a prescient report, a prescient strategy to say, we're not going to back off of this. We have created the rules that have allowed globalization to happen. Now we've got to get our act together internally so we take advantage of it too. You fast forward to today, and the world is still globalized. We're just not part of it. That's the interesting thing. With all the tariffs, everything that we are doing, trade has not stopped in the rest of the world. In fact, some say there's actually even more trade. If you just drop the United States out, there's more trade. It's like other countries in the world didn't all of a sudden look at all the tariffs and say, oh, I guess we should, we don't want to trade. We don't want to be part of a globalized world. This is dangerous. No, it's like, they're always like, sure, you got to pay the tariffs to the United States, right? Got to deal with that crazy guy. But we're going to trade with each other. We're going to trade with China, right? The other thing that's really remarkable on this is, so going back to that, when I talked about the 1980s, one of the reasons I think Bob North was wrong for 30 years is that actually the WTO and the international economic institutions actually did a good job. They actually created the rules of the road so that, yes, there was friction between countries, there were trade disputes, right? But they didn't become shooting wars. They were resolved, right? That's a good thing. So I actually think the economic institutions were doing the job that they were supposed to do. Now, I'm not putting this all on President Trump, because even after the first Trump administration, when the Biden folks came in, they had studied this problem and came to the conclusion that America was losing from globalization. And so they weren't going to become anti-globalization, but they were going to introduce more protections. They actually introduced a set of tariffs before the second round with Trump, where the Trump ones just become willy-nilly, take it that, this, 20%, 40%, 100%, right? And it all driven by Trump, right? I mean, what the Biden folks were trying to do was trying to create a strategy of how do you bring back this, the great unicorn, how do you bring back manufacturing in this country, right? Is every president for the last, 40 years has thought they're going to be the one to bring back manufacturing to this country. Now, at least Biden had a theory. The theory was green jobs, and you could do climate change. In fact, all the stuff that they were doing in terms of, all of the infrastructure bills, everything they were doing were green programs dressed up as job programs. And that was their theory. It's like, if we could sell them as job programs, then we can do the green stuff. That was a good theory, good strategy. And it has been obliterated in this administration, the year and a half. It's absolutely obliterated, even though it probably, in terms of a strategy, had better chance of creating manufacturing in this country than anything that they're doing now. And, I think in all of the stuff on the tariffs, the big loser has been the United States. Everybody else is sort of adapting and realizing, okay, US, big market, but man, you can't depend on them right now, but everybody else you can depend on. So that's been a net loss. And then you finally just throw in this last, everybody had assumed for some reason that Donald Trump was a isolationist and a non-interventionist. And, in terms of obliterating a whole set of international norms and rules of the road regarding conflict, it just threw them out the window, right? They're gone. And the amount of hubris, the basic lack of forethought. I mean, how do you go to war with Iran and don't game out that what happens when ships can't go through the Straits of Hormuz? How does that happen? It happens when you have when you have a toddler making decisions. That's how it happens. That's how it, really. How do you get into a war, right? And then all of a sudden, oh my God, we're getting hurt by the price of oil. So we're going to take off sanctions against the country we're at war with so that they can ship more oil out. That's genius. And then the last one is like, oh my God, everybody's hurting in the world, including the United States and consumers and price of gas. We need gas flowing through, we need oil flowing through the Straits of Hormuz. We're going to have negotiations, send J.D. Vance off. We need a peace agreement because we need oil flowing and fertilizer and everything through the Straits of Hormuz. And then so shocking that, 10 hours of negotiation doesn't end a war. The response is, that's it. We're blockading the Straits of Hormuz. And it's like, isn't that like the equivalent, like holding a gun to your head and just saying, it's like, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to shoot myself. That's certainly what it seems. So one of the things, I'm going to stop on this because we can take questions and stuff. When I'm teaching this course on making sense of international politics, I'm bringing in folks and I'm asking them sort of like, what in the last 2 years has most surprised you in international politics? Then what in the last 20 years has surprised you? And then I want you to go back to how you were trained in international relations. And do you think how you were trained in international relations has helped you to understand what's going on today? Or actually hindered you? And I was surprised by how many people just say, no, it's hindered me. They're real blind spots in how I was taught. I mean, the first one being so many IR specialists from my age, 80s, 90s, really were taught these are two different worlds, international political economy, international security. And now it is all intertwined. And, people talk about weaponized interdependence. It's a great term. It's a pretty accurate term about sort of where we are right now. Weaponized interdependence. the intersection of economics and security. Another one being, you know what I think we weren't trained in was individual leader psychology. That is, we were taught there are great forces out in the world. You know, it's sort of like those are the, you know, those are the tides and the currents, and you know, individual personality is froth. That's the froth on the waves, right? It doesn't really matter. And now you find people realizing that the individual psychology of leaders actually matters in big ways, especially when those leaders are doing their best to tear down the guardrails around them that might have constrained them. So we are in difficult times. I worry about people getting very diffuse sense, a diffuse sense of a world in crisis, a world in entropy, a world that's just can't be controlled. I don't think we're there yet, but I think the perception of it is a really bad perception, because insecurity, citizen insecurity, and a feeling of insecurity tends to lead to bad demands. You tend to look for strong leaders. You tend to look for and tend to give authority and power to strong leaders who promise that they will bring security. But instead, it almost acts, in this case, at least in the United States, like a protection racket. This president has done more in the last year and a half to create widespread insecurity in this country than any president. At the same time, he has made more use of national security as a justification for arbitrary action than any president. Think about that. I think in his head, these things go together. The more insecurity I, create, the more willing everybody's going to let me use security as an excuse to do my own thing. And you don't want to be there. So anyway, I'll stop there, take questions. Yeah. We'll get started here. You have to turn it on.
Steve, I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit more before we open up to questions on some specific points. One is the current state of international organizations. I would just posit it's uneven. Some are in better shape than others. Are the ones that are in relatively better shape building blocks, models, potential foundations for moving forward? Or to rebuild, is it necessary to start with the most broken or the most important, maybe even with United Nations organizations, that figuring out a way to rebuild, reform, revitalize without leadership by some country? In the past, we would have said that's the United States. But what can happen? What will happen? I agree with the point you made. The rest of the world is pretending we're not relevant and is working around us. But is any of that working around us being manifest in the international institution arena? And can it work?
Yeah. So even as I, complain about the Secretary General of the last 9 years and lament sort of where the Security Council is when you have two members of the Security Council who are engaging in, wars of aggression. It's like, and have vetoes on things. That's pretty serious. Despite that, the places that were working at the UN, interestingly enough, are operational places. Like the World Food Program was doing an amazing job with no resources. I mean, and world hunger, famine, all this stuff is going up. Their need is going way up while resources are being cut. But you cannot fault them in terms of the job that they do. They've done, I think, an amazing, when they got the Nobel Prize several years ago, I thought that was really well deserved. UNHCR does a good job. The refugee crisis, we are in a refugee crisis now because so many countries who were the biggest supporters of UNHCR in the 1950s have walked away from it and walked away from their obligations. And it's not just the United States, it's many European countries as well. So there are these pockets within the UN that are operational. And I always felt that if you want to look for competence at the UN, first of all, look at who's actually doing things. They're probably doing a good job if they have to do stuff, right? But there's a bunch of the UN that they don't do anything. It's like, and in fact, they're kind of redundant. A lot of the Division on Economic and Social Affairs was overtaken by the World Bank 40 years ago in terms of information, in terms of reports, in terms of facts. Nobody goes to DESA to find out whether there's economic growth in Southeast Asia. They're first going to go to the bank, right? Or they might go to, one of the regional organizations. Now, within peace and security, we have just, I actually think we have to somehow ride out this particular storm, because nothing can be done on this organization until I think you get a new administration in Washington. And it will make a huge difference if Ukraine holds on and basically, in some sense, I mean, how you could say at this point with hundreds of thousands of people that they win. But Russia has to be stopped. And until that happens, the Security Council is going to be useless. You might have this moment. Let's just say you might have this moment. Imagine a Russian collapse where, finally they realize the game's up. They can't, this war is futile. Or Putin has a heart attack tomorrow. We get a different administration in Washington. And maybe somebody says, you know what? The organization that we set up to, maintain peace and security didn't work. Is anybody interested in trying to rethink this? Maybe. I do know this. It's like if this present Secretary General asked me to try to do what I had to do in 2003, it wouldn't go anywhere, right? If you don't have the great powers engaged in trying to make something of the organization, you're really stuck. The middle powers, especially, a lot of the Europeans and still the Nordics believe in multilateralism. And they would rally, and they're trying to gut through it. But that's all it is. We're trying to get through it. Yes.
My follow-on has to do with filling in the gap. that part of the current narrative about the great power rivalry and the Chinese competing with the United States on everything or us competing with them has focused on Chinese taking positions of authority in a wide range of multilateral organizations, including the UN. And in the narrative here that's cast, that's a bad thing.
I don't think it's a bad thing.
Well,
Yeah.
that's where I'm going.
Yeah.
Is having somebody who wants to get things done more important than having it be us?
Yeah. I mean, we've had this conversation at different times. I have a hard time wrapping my head around what has happened between the United States and China. On this particular issue, for 20 years, we kept regaling China to do more in international organizations. Do more in the UN. Do more. You're a big country. You're a superpower now. Right? I was like, you're in the club. Come on, pay more, do more, right? And then they do. And it's like, oh my God. It's like, oh, can't have that. Do you know that there are Chinese on all these committees? Do you know there are Chinese peacekeepers, Tom? It's like, yeah, we asked for it and they've delivered. It's been this, change. Look, I still think the biggest problem is not China. The biggest problem is Russia. And it boggles my mind that the Biden administration couldn't figure out that when Putin invaded Ukraine, one of the most important priorities should have been, we need to make sure that China and Russia don't pull closer. That should have been up number one. Instead, it was China's the threat. We don't know when. Could be 5 years, could be 10 years, could be 20, but we know that China is the real threat. And to me, it's just like, guys, have you read World War II? It's like, alliances of inconvenience are still alliances. And the real threat right now is, Russia has invaded, the first full-scale invasion since World War II in Europe, right? This is outrageous. And if you don't make this the priority, there's going to be problems. And we never made it the priority. In fact, we drove them closer. Every problem, look, this is a much more dangerous world that we're in. We're in a much more dangerous world. There are objective factors that are making it more dangerous. There are more existential threats. You add to the fact that, nuclear holocaust still, like, we live under that cloud, Biotechnology has gotten to the point where, people working in garages might be able to create an incredibly lethal, deadly infectious disease or wipe out our immunity to some diseases. Now you're throwing into the mix, then you still have, amazingly, because, gee, it's disappeared in the last year, 14 months, climate change. It's as if in the last year, and it's not just, it's like once, Trump, they don't care. They're trying to undermine everything that the United States has done under Biden and everything else. We're just not taking it seriously. But it's striking me like how fast a lot of countries just say, well, they're not serious, so we're not going to be serious. The problem hasn't gone away. The problem is still there, right? And now you throw in AI. And the security approach of this country has been, this is a potential existential threat in two ways. One is there could be something out there called superintelligence. And, all of a sudden, the artificial intelligence decides it's going to go rogue and we're toast. Oh, yeah, that's scary. Okay. Or a foreign power is going to use AI to undermine all of our systems through, interconnectivity, and there's going to be all kinds of havoc that an adversary could unleash. Now I hear that, and one answer, which nobody seems to even think of in this country, is, well, you might want to talk to the Chinese about that. You might want to actually talk to them, because I see this as much more akin to nuclear racing in the 50s than anything else. All of this quest right now to have the best AI model, it's not like the second best isn't going to be really deadly, right? And who knows who's going to come out on top of this? The Chinese don't know if they're going to come out on top. We don't know. You would think that in that veil of ignorance, you might want to have some conversations, but no, but we don't. But that's the kind of thing that those things have to happen for, again, to get back. And if they did, then international organizations could play a role, just like, if you actually had a non-proliferation agreement, or you had some kind of an agreement to slow down AI or put ring fences around some of the developments, then maybe there's a role for international organizations. But then it would be the benefit of that would be, again, it's a problem, right? Here's a problem where we need cooperation, we need institutionalized cooperation, and who's going to get it for us?
I'm going to do one more before opening it up. And that's sort of the levels of international cooperation, from global and most of the discussion, but you mentioned regional, the multilateral, minilateral, things that can be worked out or are being tackled on a regional level. Necessity, it's just too hard to get it at a global level. So you do the best you can. Useful building block for later on, inclusivity, everybody's in it, or builds a set of incompatible subsystems that are hard to integrate. And the default corrective for decades was that the great, big, powerful, rich Americans had to be a part of it. So we weren't going to sign up to something with the Europeans that wasn't compatible with what we were trying to do in Asia or Latin America. We don't play that role. Can anybody play that role? But how do we proceed from here? How will the world proceed from where we are?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing from, trust in the United States has evaporated. And, you get a different president who cares about these kinds of things. You can start rebuilding. You got to stop digging the hole, and you got to start rebuilding, right? The fact that, I think in the end, the Europeans are going to be, they're going to be stronger, right? I think they are going to be more connected. They're going to be stronger. I think that's all a good thing. In Asia, and I think were you to get a different president with a different foreign policy, I think the connections can come back to a certain degree on Europe. I worry in Asia because I just don't, I don't know. In the absence of the United States, I don't see what actually I don't see Asia minus China coming together like the EU, right? That's not going to happen, right? I don't know. It can go all kinds of ways, but that's where, but what you're talking about is like, we are at one of these moments where it really can just go, 40 different ways. And some countries some regions, there are fault lines, and it doesn't matter what we do. The fault lines are there. I think Latin America was very telling when, Trump creates this something shield. Well, I forgot the name of it, which was going to be go after drug cartels in Latin America. Doesn't have Brazil, doesn't have Mexico, doesn't have Colombia. One other, Peru, maybe? I mean, those are big countries. You would think if you're going to have a regional initiative, you'd want to have those countries as part of the regional initiative. They don't care.
Steve, I'm going to let you field questions here for a few minutes, then we'll switch to Zoom.
Okay.
So I'll just let you
Great.
pick.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask what should be a pretty quick question. You mentioned that Russia needs to be stopped, but I'm going to ask you to provide details, provide strategy, provide a policy, provide a program that would stop Russia, because I'm beginning to see this as like squaring the circle. They're just, Putin is not going to give in. And I've also seen speculation that even if, like, as you suggested, he had a heart attack and is no longer with us, there'll be another Russian, general military type who would be equally intransigent about Ukraine.
On the leadership point, point is taken. We don't know, but there's also, look, you can't take those kinds of casualties and deaths and economic devastation within your own country, and it doesn't necessarily lead to the guy who follows Putin saying, sign me up, right? It doesn't necessarily lead to that. I think it's a fair bet. I think you might actually get some realism to say this, we're going to end this now. Why I say why I still hold out hope for Ukraine prevailing in this is that the United States has not done a damn thing since in the last 15, 16 months. And they played them to a draw with just devastating casualties every month. This is just grinding, violent, basically trench warfare with drones. And they haven't given up anything. And for my scenario to work, you can't do stupid things like go to war with Iran, which all of a sudden, makes Russian oil really valuable again, right? You had them on the frickin' ropes, and now the oil income is going to take them off the ropes for a bit. I don't know for how long, but yeah, I actually think the biggest stories of the last the 4 years of this war now is everything that Russia has put into this, all the advantages in manpower, all of the advantages, they got nothing to show for it, except a lot of deaths.
Any thoughts on that change the calculus with the result of Hungary's elections today?
I don't know if it changes anybody's calculus. I think it changes people's hope, which is a really good and important thing. And I was struck. First of all, I was struck by, if you've seen the the extent of this victory. So the sweeping, they're going to have a super majority. The opposition is going to have a super majority in parliament, even though Orban, had set up the rules. The rules were all set up for his party to like hang on in various ways. This result just wiped that out. They've got a super majority. I was struck by the fact that it was about 45 minutes. He actually calls the opposition guy and says, "You won," and then goes to his supporters and said, "Not the result we wanted." That gave me hope. So both the extent of the victory and also the fact that this was not a toddler who immediately started claiming this was stolen from us and stuff, which would have been awful, right? This is always the best kind of outcome. So hope, yeah, I don't know if it changes calculations and stuff. I think this will help the Ukrainians, right? Because you've just taken away one of the big sort of the gatekeepers, that's what Orban was doing, was in terms of aid, money, all kinds of stuff. He's gone now, so.
Well, when it comes to the idea of these tariffs that Trump was so enthusiastic of using his power for, I wonder how that ties in with the idea of international sanction cooperation, because my first impression was if he raised all these tariffs on imports, there'd be much more government involvement to regulate the importing and exporting, and he would be growing his employment of governing inspection. And I'm wondering if that is similar to how internationally they sanction places like Cuba, Venezuela, Iran. I mean, it seems to me that these sanctions are sort of the financial market people or someone that can use computers to watch the certain people with money, influence with money. And I'm just wondering if it's just a bunch more of these enforcements of law, like financial law. I just believe we're all more nearsighted with phones now, because these computers they have can pick out infractions against these things like sanctioning any kind of trade. But I just don't think that they could have enforced the tariffs.
Well, the tariffs were to my mind, were a non-starter, because first of all, they weren't stable. There was nobody could create stable expectations around tariff rate. They were killing businesses here, right? Some businesses don't know what to charge people when there was an NPR story interviewing a musical instrument company in Houston. And so somebody comes in and says, "I want a really good, very fancy trumpet," let's say. Trombone, trumpet, doesn't matter. It's not made in the United States. Okay, the price, first of all, we don't know when we're going to get it. The price will be between $4,000 and $7,000, or it'll be between $7,000 and $10,000. How do you do business that way, right? That was so there were all these kinds of problems. Now, as to what you're describing, in some ways, yeah, I mentioned this term, weaponized interdependence, and the United States kind of way before Trump understood this. I mean, if you go back even during Obama's years and before, the United States actually has an enormous amount of effect on the global banking system, right? And there are ways of cutting countries, actors, you put them on a list. There really are ways to make it very difficult for them to get money, move money, any of that, right? Because of what we do, our role in the international banking system. And it can be misused. And just give you an example of the misuse of this power. So you probably read there's a UN, the UN Special Rapporteur for Gaza is I believe she's either Italian or Swiss. This is the woman who wrote the report that accused Israel of genocide. The United States under Trump put her on a terrorist watch list, which meant she could not hold property in this country. She could not bank, right? Her husband was an employee of the World Bank outside of Washington, D.C., right? She's a foreign national, yeah. But it's a complete abuse of the terrorist carve out for going after somebody's money, right? I think, I will say this, I think this has to do with our democracy. There's all kinds of problems with our democracy. But one of them in particular is Congress has just sort of laid down and allowed, not just this last year and a half, but for a long time has laid down whenever a president claims any kind of emergency or exception, always based on security. It's egregious right now because of the things that Donald Trump keeps saying are a national security threat, including wind power. Did you know wind power is a threat to national security? Do you know that government unions are a threat to national security under Donald Trump? Signed the authorization. It goes on and on. Doing his new
I am a
East
threat to
Wing.
national security on Donald Trump's list.
Yeah, what's that?
I personally am a threat to national security on his list.
Right. So, and the branch of government that has to stand up is, everybody keeps hoping that somehow the courts are going to do this, and the courts fight their battle, and then the Supreme Court often gives them a get out of democracy free card. But Congress has to do its job. Congress can stop these exceptions, right? And they don't. The other thing that they don't do is, that the exceptions that were built in during the Iranian hostage crisis are still on the books 40 years, 46 years later, 47 years later. They're renewed every year. Congress has the power of the purse. Congress could stop this. But these things they get claimed as an exception for national security, and they just go on and on, and it's really bad. I think this is like, so it sort of flies under the radar, but yeah.
I want to shift to those on Zoom. Rick, do you have some questions collected?
Yes, I'll attempt my best to sort of summarize some of them. One of them is, even if the Democrats take control of Congress in the midterm elections, has this administration done much damage to international order that rebuilding it will be impossible? Or to what effect might the change as a result of the upcoming election have any improvement on the international order and our perception in that order?
I think I still am an optimist, and so the Canadian Prime Minister gave this great speech at Davos about the rupture in the international system, and then had a number of recommendations for how like second tier states are going to somehow replace the order that was created by the United States. Look, I would never say it can't be rebuilt. It will have to be rebuilt differently. It will have to be rebuilt on a much more equitable basis, probably. But I'm not so pessimistic as to say, no, we're done. It's gone. It'll never come back. It won't come back as it was. Something else is going to have to replace it. But I think if you have a different administration and a different foreign policy in Washington, then America will help shape that. That's my hope.
Got another one, Rick?
Yeah, this may have been addressed to some extent previously, but what do you think will happen with the UN in the future? And I would emphasize the long-term future. And would a change in leadership help make it relevant again? Are there other institutions that could take its place, at least in some part?
About the UN?
Yes, about the UN.
Yeah. Again, I will say, I think the future of the UN is going to depend dramatically on a change of leadership in Washington. But as I said, a lot is going to depend on how the war in Ukraine comes out. If tomorrow Ukraine were to collapse and Russia moves 200 miles into Ukraine, there's not going to be a UN. There's not going to be a UN. I mean, the UN will have failed, absolutely. If somehow Ukraine holds on and Russia fails, then first of all, the lesson will be for everybody, maybe going to war in this particular era with changes in technology like drones and so forth, maybe it's a lot harder than you think. And maybe there's a good reason why you ought to try various, resolutions and solutions short of going to war. That would be a good thing to have as a lesson, from this. And you could have that lesson.
Rick, do we have one more from the Zoom? Rick?
I was on mute.
Okay.
The last question was mostly been addressed. It had to do with the impact of Orban's defeat in Hungary. Are there any kind of trends? Does it strengthen the EU? To what degree is the impact on Ukraine versus Russia? Now, you may have addressed that in part already, but if you'd like to say some more.
I see it helping Ukraine. I see it helping the EU. And at this particular point, those are really good things. And helping Hungary.
Let's go back.
But
Let's go back in the room.
Right here. You'll pass.
You began talking about how the globalization was trying to bring manufacturing back. Oh, the U.S. was trying to bring back manufacturing, and I'm wondering if we ever gave up being the leader in weapons and why that might be contributing to what happened with Israel and what might be happening in the Gulf, is that we can always get more weapons built, and so we're happy to sell them to other people and that kind of thing. I mean, I don't think they've talked about the fact that when it went all offshore, they were keeping their secrets about weapons in this country.
So, first of all, I'm not an expert on U.S. armaments and U.S. armament manufacture. From what I read, we almost have from what I read, it's almost the exact opposite problem, which is we are wasting munitions that we cannot replace in a very quick, rapid pace, which suggests that, again, your ability to manufacture these things, you get into a hot war and you expend them really fast. The other thing being is, again, I'm not an expert on this, but the changes in warfare to drones, where America's not the leading manufacturer of these things. The whole way of war, conduct of war is just changing dramatically. And I don't think we're prepared for that. The United States, everywhere, a lot of places are. Ukraine certainly is now. Russia is. Iran is. We're not. So, but that's, you know, that's not the narrative that has driven Trump and Biden to a certain extent has to do with, you know, what was called the China shock, that when China joined the WTO, you can actually trace it to jobs lost in various manufacturing parts of this country who, not surprisingly, turned to Trump. They became Trump voters. There's now a paper out, a set of economists have, you know, done an in-depth look at NAFTA in the 90s. And actually, now, you know, a lot of the complaints about NAFTA in the 90s have been borne out. There were parts of this country that took huge economic hits in terms of job losses, right? And again, a correlation between those places becoming Trump voters, Republican voters in the last 10 years. It's all correlation, it's not causation, but it looks pretty, it makes sense, it's plausible. And so the hope is every president wants to rebuild American not weapons, manufacturing. They want to make cars, they want to make steel, they want to make things, right? We're going to bring back good jobs. And the only answer that made sense to me, Biden's, was, yeah, if you can make these in green industry, right? If you do it in infrastructure, but if you also do it in green jobs, net benefit, you're fighting climate change, and maybe we're creating manufacturing again, okay? But a lot of this stuff is implausible. You know, I just complained about presidents invoking security, but in the last days of the Biden administration, Biden declares, you know, Japan wants to buy out, you know, American Steel Company in Pennsylvania. Biden, not Trump, Biden says, no, that's a national security threat. Really, having an ally, you know, buy one of your companies is a national security threat. Had nothing to do with national security. You know, it was like, how do I hold on to votes in Pennsylvania? That's what that was about. So this temptation of using security is not just a Republican thing. It is a Democratic and a Republican thing. It's on steroids right now. But presidents, both parties, this is like really convenient. And it's to be discouraged, I think. But.
Another question? Rick, do you have any more?
Unmute yourself.
Rick, do you have any more questions?
Double checking. No, there's no additional questions at this time.
Okay. Again, apologies because getting up is hard. Before thanking you, Steve, for excellent presentation, I want to thank everybody who has participated over the last 9 weeks, because we took one off, both in person and in Zoom, and in the people that tune into the videos afterwards. We reach a pretty large audience. We run between 30 and 70 in each of these, Steve. I think the selection of topics in the workbook, for those who've read it, in the series of speakers that we've had, gives a pretty good overview of a complex system, the many points of vulnerability in that system, and the damage that has been done to that system by substituting petulance for policy by the still most important country in the world. that the Great Decisions series is aimed at public education. So that ordinary people, not folks like Steve and I that do this stuff every day, but will have a better understanding when reading the newspapers, watching the TV, talking to neighbors, talking about the consequences of elections, that the better informed we are, the more control we can exert over the future. And one of the things that has been underscored by Steve's presentation tonight is we fell down on a job. Citizenry, Congress, corporate world, we were simply too complacent when we were not being misguidedly malevolent. I hate to end on that kind of sour note, because what I really want people to take away is this series, your participation has done at least a little bit in this place at this time to not just examine, but begin to work towards some solutions. So Steve, thank you for giving us of your time and your insight and the answers to the questions. So please, in Zoom land and here, join me in thanking Steve Stedman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stedman. You were great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah. Rick, you have final words for the Zoom people and getting us offline?
No, we'll end the meeting soon, but thanks to you, Tom, especially as being our leader throughout this entire series and in years past. This meeting has been recorded and will be available in a few days. There'll be an email about that. And that's all from myself.
Okay. Thank you all.
Great.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, you bet.
Pessimistic.